My parents spent 20 years comparing me to my brother. Then they accidentally compared our tax returns. The email subject line read, FWD, look how well Michael is doing. It was from my mother, sent to what should have been a private family group thread, but had accidentally included me on the reply all. And attached to it was a PDF she never meant for me to see, my brother Michael's tax return alongside mine, side by side, because my mother had apparently asked my aunt, who worked in accounting, to compare our numbers just for fun. I sat at my desk at work, coffee going cold beside my keyboard, and stared at the screen for a long time before I opened the attachment. I already knew in some instinctive way that what I was about to see was going to change something. I just didn't know yet how much. My name is Rachel. I'm 34. My brother Michael is 36. And for as long as I can remember, genuinely, as far back as any memory I have, my parents have been comparing us. Not gently, not the normal sibling rivalry way that most families do it. Relentlessly. Structurally. As if comparison wasn't a habit but a parenting philosophy they'd committed to with the seriousness of a religious practice. It started small, the way these things do. Michael walked earlier than me, according to family lore, and my mother mentioned this at approximately every birthday party I had between the ages of 4 and 12. Michael read chapter books in 2nd grade. I was apparently a bit behind in comparison, despite being an entirely different child with an entirely different developmental timeline. By the time we were both in high school, the comparisons had calcified into something almost ritualistic. Michael made varsity soccer. I was in the school play, and somehow this always got mentioned as though I'd settled for something lesser, even though I loved theater and had no interest in soccer at all. Michael got into a state university with a partial scholarship. I got into a smaller liberal arts college with a partial scholarship of my own, and my father's first reaction was to ask if I'd tried applying anywhere Michael had gotten into, as if the acceptance itself was a kind of failure on my part for not chasing his path. I want to be clear that Michael, for what it's worth, was never cruel about any of this. He didn't ask for the comparisons. If anything, I think they weighed on him too, in a different way, the pressure to always be the standard, the reference point, the thing everyone else was measured against. We were never particularly close as kids, not out of dislike, but because our parents had structured our entire relationship around competition rather than partnership. It's hard to feel like a teammate with someone you've been trained since birth to see as a yardstick. The comparisons followed us into adulthood in ways that became almost absurd if I stepped back and looked at them objectively. Michael got married at 28. At 28, single, I got asked at every family gathering when I was going to catch up. Michael and his wife Jessica bought a house in the suburbs. 2 years later, when I bought a condo in the city, my mother's first comment was that it was cute, for now, implying it was a starter step toward the real accomplishment of a house like Michael's, rather than a deliberate choice I'd made because I loved city living and had no interest in a house with a yard I'd have to maintain. Career was where it got the most pointed. Michael worked in sales for a regional distribution company, a solid, steady job with decent commission structures. I had built a career in freelance graphic design and eventually my own small design studio, which I ran out of a rented office with 2 part-time employees. For 15 years, my parents treated Michael's career as the serious, stable, adult choice, and mine as something closer to a hobby that hadn't quite grown up yet. Despite the fact that by my early 30s, my studio was profitable, my client list included 2 Fortune 500 companies, and I was, by any reasonable financial measure, doing quite well for myself. Michael has such job security, my mother would say, apropos of nothing, at dinners where I hadn't asked about job security at all. It must be so stressful, not knowing where your next paycheck is coming from, my father would add, even though I'd explained, multiple times in detail, how retainer contracts worked, how my income was actually more predictable than they assumed, how I had built financial cushions specifically to manage the freelance rhythm they seemed to think was chaos. I tried, over the years in different ways, to push back on the narrative. Sometimes gently, mentioning a big new client, a magazine feature about my studio, a speaking engagement at a design conference. Sometimes less gently, once, at 31, after a particularly grating Thanksgiving where my father spent 20 minutes describing Michael's recent promotion to regional manager, while my own studio's 5-year anniversary, which had happened that same month, went entirely unmentioned. I finally said, evenly, I'd love it if we could talk about something other than Michael's job for once. My mother looked wounded, said I was being sensitive, and the subject was dropped, but not really, it just came back the next time, dressed up differently. There was another moment, around my 33rd birthday, that I think about often. My parents threw a small dinner, and my mother had, unprompted, invited Michael and Jessica along, which was fine, except the entire evening somehow became a recap of Michael and Jessica's recent kitchen renovation. The granite countertops, the new appliances, how proud my father was that Michael could provide that kind of life for his family. Nobody asked me a single question about my life the entire night, not about my studio, not about the new hire I'd brought on the month before, not about anything. I sat there with a slice of birthday cake I hadn't ordered, at a dinner that was supposed to be about me, listening to 45 minutes about someone else's countertops, and I remember thinking with a strange, hollow clarity that I had simply stopped being visible in that house. Not disliked. Not rejected, exactly. Just quietly filed under the other one, a category that didn't require updates, questions, or curiosity, because the family narrative had already decided what I was years before and stopped checking whether it was still true. I stopped bringing things up after that. I learned the way you learn most difficult lessons, through repeated proof rather than a single moment, that my parents were not going to update their internal model of who Michael was and who I was, no matter what evidence I presented. Michael was the stable one. I was the risky one. It didn't matter what my bank account said. It had become identity, not observation, and identity, once fixed in a parent's mind, is remarkably resistant to fact. I want to talk about what I actually built during those years, partly because it matters to the story, and partly because I think it's important, after 2 decades of being quietly undersold, to say it plainly, without apologizing for the confidence in it. I started my design studio at 26 with $4,000 in savings and a laptop that was already 2 years out of date. I worked 80-hour weeks for the first 3 years, took every project regardless of how small, and slowly built a reputation for a very specific kind of clean, considered branding work that eventually got me noticed by bigger clients. By 30, I had hired my first part-time employee. By 32, I'd moved into an actual office instead of my apartment. By 34, the year all of this came to a head, my studio had done just over $400,000 in revenue the previous year, with a healthy margin, no debt, and a growing roster of long-term retainer clients. There were years in there that were genuinely brutal, the kind of stretch I don't think Michael, with his steady base salary and health benefits, ever had to navigate. I remember a 6-month period in my late 20s when I lost my 2 biggest clients within weeks of each other. One because the company got acquired and slashed its marketing budget. The other because the founder I'd worked with for 2 years decided to bring design in-house. I ate through almost all my savings that stretch, took on projects I would have turned down a year earlier just to keep the lights on, and didn't tell my parents any of it, because I already knew exactly what they would say. I could hear it before they said it. This is what happens when you don't have something stable. So I didn't tell them. I white-knuckled through it alone, rebuilt my client base slowly, and came out the other side with systems in place, retainer contracts, a cash reserve equal to 6 months of expenses, a diversified roster so no single client could ever again take down a third of my income in one phone call. Nobody in my family ever knew that stretch happened. As far as they were concerned, my business had simply continued along in its vague, presumably precarious way, the way it always had in their imagination. I never told my parents the specific numbers, either during the hard years or the good ones. Partly out of privacy, partly, I think, because some quiet, protective part of me suspected that even the actual truth wouldn't be enough to shift 20 years of narrative, and I didn't want to hand them a number just to watch them find a way to diminish it anyway. I'd seen it happen before in smaller ways, the time I mentioned landing a retainer with a national retail chain, and my mother's response was to ask if that meant I'd finally consider getting a real office job now that you have some good experience to put on a resume. As if the retainer itself, worth more in a single year than most entry-level salaries, was simply a stepping stone toward the legitimacy of working for someone else. Which brings me back to that email. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, has done our family's taxes informally for years, nothing official, just helping out, since she works in accounting at a mid-sized firm. Apparently, at some family gathering I hadn't attended, my mother had asked Carol, half joking, to see how the kids are doing financially. And Carol, either not realizing the sensitivity or not thinking it through, had pulled the AGI figures from both my and Michael's returns, since she'd done both of our taxes that year as a favor, and put together a simple 1-page comparison. She'd sent it to my mother privately. My mother, apparently thrilled and wanting to share Michael's numbers with the extended family group chat, forwarded it, and, in the fog of family thread reply all confusion that happens to every family eventually, included me by mistake. The document was clinical, almost funny in its plainness. 2 columns. Michael, adjusted gross income, $71,400. Rachel, adjusted gross income, $198,600. Underneath, in my aunt's typed notes, a small, almost throwaway line. Rachel's studio really took off nearly triple Michael's. I read it 3 times before it fully landed. I want to describe what I felt because it wasn't quite vindication, not in the clean, satisfying way you might expect. It was something messier, a kind of retroactive grief, mixed with disbelief, mixed with a slow-burning anger that took a few days to fully surface. 20 years. 20 years of being gently, persistently positioned as the less stable, less successful, less together sibling, and the numbers, the actual, cold, undeniable numbers in my parents' own household, pulled by their own relative, said something entirely different. Not just different, nearly triple. I didn't respond to the email right away. I sat with it. I called my best friend, Priya, who had listened to 2 decades of my complaints about the Michael comparisons over wine and takeout, and read her the email over the phone. She was quiet for a second and then said, "Rachel, I need you to actually let yourself be angry about this instead of just being amused by the irony, because I think you're doing the thing where you turn pain into a funny story before you've actually felt it." She was right. I sat with the anger for a few days, actually let myself feel it instead of packaging it into something palatable. I thought about every dinner where Michael's steady paycheck had been held up as the responsible path while my growing studio was treated as a phase. I thought about my 30th birthday, when my mother had asked, in front of my entire extended family, whether I'd thought about maybe getting something more stable, just as a backup. While Michael, 2 years into his sales job, had never once been asked to consider a backup plan for anything. I decided after about a week that I wasn't going to let this be another thing I quietly absorbed. I'd absorbed enough over 2 decades, the birthday dinner about someone else's kitchen, the 30th birthday comment about backup plans, the retainer contract dismissed as a resume line item. This felt different. This wasn't a feeling I could be talked out of, or a slight vague enough to be reframed as my own oversensitivity. This was a number, printed in black and white, that my own family had generated without my involvement, and it said, plainly, that the story they'd been telling for 20 years had never been true. But I also didn't want to handle it the way I might have at 25, with a furious, tearful confrontation that would get filed away as me being too sensitive again. I wanted something that couldn't be argued with, and, as it turned out, my mother had already handed me exactly that. I asked my parents to come over for dinner, just the 2 of them, no Michael, which was unusual enough that my mother asked twice if everything was okay. I told her everything was fine, that I just wanted to catch up. I made a simple dinner, nothing elaborate, because I didn't want the evening to feel like a production. I wanted it to feel ordinary right up until it wasn't. Over dessert, I brought out my laptop and pulled up the email. "I got this a couple weeks ago," I said, turning the screen toward them. "I think it was meant for the family group chat." My mother's face did something complicated: recognition, then embarrassment, then something that looked almost like fear. My father leaned in, read the numbers, and went quiet in a way I'd genuinely never seen from him before. "I've been thinking about this for 2 weeks, I said, keeping my voice steady because I'd rehearsed this part, knowing I'd need to. "I've been thinking about every dinner where Michael's job got held up as the stable, adult choice, and mine got treated like a hobby I hadn't grown out of yet. I've been thinking about being asked, at my own 30th birthday, if I'd thought about getting something more stable as a backup. I want to understand, genuinely, not rhetorically, what about these numbers looks unstable to you?" My mother started to say something about how it wasn't about money, that she'd never meant it that way, that she just worried about me because freelance work seemed so uncertain. I let her finish, and then I asked, gently but directly, whether uncertainty had ever actually been the issue, or whether it was simply that Michael's path looked more familiar to them, more like the kind of life they understood, and mine, self-directed, entrepreneurial, unconventional, had never quite fit the shape of success they recognized, regardless of what it actually produced. My father, to his credit, was the one who eventually said something honest. He said that he thought, deep down, he'd always assumed a real job meant working for someone else, a paycheck, a boss, the structure he'd had his whole life at the same manufacturing supplier he'd worked for 30 years. He said running your own business had always seemed, to him, like something that could disappear overnight, even though he'd never actually looked closely enough at my business to know whether that was true. He said, quietly, that he was ashamed it had taken a spreadsheet, of all things, to make him realize he'd never really asked me how my studio worked, what my client relationships looked like, how I'd built the security he'd assumed I didn't have. My mother cried, though I noticed, and I don't say this unkindly, that some of the tears seemed to be about her own embarrassment at being caught rather than genuine reflection on 20 years of comparison. But she did say one thing that mattered to me. "I think I compared you too because it was easier than actually seeing either of you clearly. If I said Michael was steady and you were the risk taker, I didn't have to think too hard about what either of those things actually meant for who you both really are." That was, honestly, the most useful sentence either of my parents had said to me in years. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was an explanation that finally made sense of 2 decades of behavior, not comparison as malice, but comparison as a kind of parental shortcut, a way of avoiding the harder work of actually understanding 2 different children as 2 different people, Each building lives that made sense on their own terms. I told Michael about the email a few days later, mostly because I didn't want him hearing a distorted version of it from our mother first. He laughed, a real laugh, and then said something that surprised me. Honestly, Rachel, I felt weird for years about how much they build me up around you. I make decent money, but I've never felt like I was doing anything special. I show up, I sell industrial fasteners, I go home. Meanwhile, you built an actual company from nothing. I used to feel like I was supposed to be embarrassed for you at family stuff, and I never understood why, because from where I was standing, you were the one doing something impressive. That conversation did more for my relationship with Michael than 20 years of forced comparison ever had. We talk more now, actually talk, not through the filter of who our parents think we are. He's asked me for advice about a side business idea he's been sitting on for years, something involving custom industrial parts sourcing, an idea he'd apparently had for over a decade but never mentioned to anyone in the family, because bringing up ambition around me had always felt, to him, like stepping into territory that was supposed to be mine. We had dinner, just the two of us, a few weeks after the email surfaced, and he told me something that stuck with me. That he used to dread family gatherings almost as much as I did, not because he disliked the attention, but because he could feel how much it cost me, and he never knew how to say anything about it without it seeming like he was fishing for more praise. I used to just sit there, he said, hoping they'd change the subject and feeling like a jerk for not saying anything, because saying something felt like it would just make it about me again. It made me realize how much of the damage in that house hadn't just been done to me. It had warped Michael too, just differently, turning him into a kind of reluctant trophy who'd never been allowed to simply be a person with his own uncertainties, because his role in the family narrative required him to always look effortlessly successful next to me. My parents haven't stopped comparing entirely. 20 years of habit doesn't dissolve over one dinner and one accidental email, but it's different now. My mother catches herself sometimes mid-sentence, and I can see her recalibrating in real time. My father actually asked me, a few months later, if I could walk him through how retainer contracts worked, genuinely curious this time instead of skeptical, and I spent an hour explaining my business model to him at his kitchen table, watching something shift in his face as the abstraction of freelance, so unstable, became a concrete, understandable system with real numbers behind it. A few weeks after that dinner, my mother asked if she could come by the studio, just to see it, which she'd never actually done in the 8 years I'd had a physical office. I walked her through it, the small conference room where I met with clients, the wall where I'd framed a few of the campaigns I was proudest of, my 2 employees, Danielle and Sam, who she'd only ever heard about secondhand. She was quiet for most of the visit, taking it in, and at one point she picked up a framed magazine feature I'd nearly forgotten was even on the wall, a regional business publication that had profiled me 2 years earlier under the headline Designers to Watch. She read the whole thing standing there, and when she finished, she said, quietly, almost to herself, "I don't think I ever really understood that this was a real thing. I think I always pictured you at your kitchen table, kind of hoping for the best." It wasn't dramatic, but it was, I think, the moment she actually believed it, in a way the spreadsheet alone hadn't quite accomplished. Numbers can prove something is real. Sometimes people still need to see the walls, the desks, the framed evidence of it before it fully lands. I keep a printed copy of that email in a drawer in my studio, not out of bitterness, but as a strange kind of artifact, a reminder that sometimes the truth doesn't arrive through confrontation or conversation, but through an accident, a reply-all mistake, a spreadsheet meant for someone else's eyes. 20 years of being quietly positioned as the less stable sibling, undone by a single forwarded PDF that told the truth more plainly than I ever could have said it myself. I think about, sometimes, how differently things might have gone if my aunt had simply sent that comparison privately to my mother, and it had stayed there, unseen, filed away like so many other small unfairnesses in that family's history. I think about how much of what happens between parents and adult children depends on these strange accidents. A forgotten reply-all, an open laptop, a document that was never meant to travel as far as it did. I don't think my parents would have ever volunteered the comparison themselves. I don't think, without that PDF landing in my inbox, I would have ever had the clean, undeniable proof I needed to finally interrupt 20 years of a story that had nothing to do with the actual facts of my life. I don't need my parents to admit I was right about everything. I've stopped needing that, mostly. What I needed, it turned out, was simpler: to be seen accurately, even if it took an accident to make it happen. The numbers were always there, quietly proving themselves every year in a filing cabinet nobody in my family had ever bothered to open. I just finally got to watch my parents actually look at them, and in looking, finally see me, not the risky one, not the sibling who needed to catch up, but a woman who had built something real, entirely on her own terms, while everyone around her was busy measuring her against a yardstick that had never actually fit.